It began quietly, as most extraordinary events do, in a small observatory tucked high in the mountains. The cold wind rattled against the metal roof, and inside, a lone astronomer scanned the endless black sky with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. For months, the team had been watching distant stars, cataloging data, and running routine scans. Space was vast and silent, and the work often felt like listening to whispers in a storm. Then, one evening, a pattern appeared on the screen, a subtle, repeating signal coming from the far reaches of the solar system. At first, it seemed like a mistake. Electronics are sensitive, prone to glitches, and humans even more so when they hope too hard to see meaning in chaos. But as the astronomer watched, the same signal repeated, not randomly but with precision. Each pulse carried a rhythm that was impossible to dismiss. The observatory quickly contacted colleagues around the world. Within hours, the same signal was confirmed at multiple locations, and the quiet certainty in the eyes of those scientists spoke louder than any words. This was not a natural phenomenon. Something intelligent, something deliberate was trying to communicate. News traveled quietly at first. Governments and scientific institutions received encrypted messages about unexplained transmissions. Press releases were drafted but never released. People outside the scientific community remained unaware, and the world continued its daily routines, unaware that the first true sign of something far greater than themselves had arrived. Inside the observatory, the mood was tense. Every scientist understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. They had seen the first evidence that humanity was not alone, not merely in the stars but in the intelligent minds that might exist beyond them. Conversations were hushed, cautious, and deliberate. One scientist suggested sending a response, a simple acknowledgement. Another warned that this was dangerous. Who knew what might be listening and what kind of danger they might bring if provoked? Weeks passed. The signal continued, repeating at regular intervals, almost like a heartbeat. It waited patiently for humanity to react, for someone to answer. Outside, ordinary life went on as usual. Children played in parks, markets bustled, and people walked their routines without a second thought to the invisible eyes watching from the edges of the solar system. Inside the observatory, discussions grew heated. Scientists argued over protocol, ethical responsibility, and potential risks. Some believed that silence was safer, that it was wiser to wait and study before acting. Others felt a moral duty to respond, to greet whoever or whatever had reached out across the void. Every delay felt heavier than the last, as if the universe itself was growing impatient. Eventually, the matter reached the highest levels of global oversight. Representatives from every major country convened under the guise of routine security meetings. The world outside remained oblivious, blissfully unaware of the tense deliberations occurring in secure rooms far from public view. Military officers warned of hidden dangers, painting vivid scenarios of alien aggression. Scientists argued that knowledge could not be allowed to hide, that curiosity was the foundation of civilization itself. Religious leaders added their voices, interpreting the signal through faith and morality, some seeing it as a divine test, others as a warning. As the debate raged, the signal persisted, unwavering. It repeated with the same rhythm, a quiet but undeniable message that waited for an answer. The longer humanity hesitated, the heavier the silence became, pressing on those who understood its importance. It was not a threat, not yet, but it carried a weight that few could explain. The universe had reached out and humanity had remained still. Back in the observatory, the lone astronomer stayed late into the night, eyes glued to the screen. Every pulse felt personal, a quiet knock on a door that humanity had not yet opened. The thought settled like a stone in the chest. Someone or something had waited for them and they had not answered. Weeks turned into months. Governments continued their discussions in endless cycles of caution, yet no unified message was sent. Some nations secretly attempted minor transmissions, barely enough to signal curiosity, while others chose complete silence. The world remained unaware, moving through its ordinary concerns. Natural disasters, elections, and daily life consumed the attention of billions, and the extraordinary went unnoticed, waiting patiently beyond the veil of stars. The scientists grew restless. The rhythm of the signal became familiar, almost comforting, yet every repetition reminded them that humanity was standing still. They debated sending a personal, unsanctioned message, something simple, a sign that humans had heard. But fear restrained them. Caution shadowed their resolve. Each day the signal came and went, unwavering, like a heartbeat counting the time humanity refused to acknowledge it. Outside the walls of the observatory, the world did not pause. Children laughed, parents worried about work and bills, and cities hummed with life. The vast distances of space made the events seem distant, irrelevant. Yet within the quiet hum of the universe, patience was a test few could understand. Inside, the astronomer finally made a choice. Alone, after long nights and careful thought, a small, simple message was prepared. It was not official. It carried no symbols of power, no political statements, only a human greeting encoded in the language of numbers and hydrogen, the simplest form of communication known to science. The message was sent into the void, a whisper from one species hoping to reach another. The next day, silence. The signal stopped. It did not repeat as before. No response came. The world outside noticed nothing, unaware of the moment when the universe had paused to listen and humanity had barely spoken. The observatory's staff exchanged worried glances, their hearts heavy with uncertainty. Had the message reached its destination? Or had the silence meant that opportunity had passed, that the patient wait of the cosmos had ended in vain? Months later, the implications began to sink in. The astronomer often stood alone on the mountain, gazing at the stars, wondering what they had missed. Each twinkling light felt distant yet close, as if silently judging the hesitation of those who had waited too long. No one else could feel the weight, the quiet that spoke louder than any sound. In the halls of power, debates continued, but the momentum had shifted. Fear had replaced curiosity. Routine replaced urgency. Humanity had chosen caution, and the cosmos, patient as it was, had moved on. Yet in the observatory, in the quiet of the night, one person understood what had been lost. The universe had reached out, and humanity had failed to answer in time, even today. The astronomer remembers the rhythm of that signal. Each pulse carries the echo of hope and the weight of hesitation. It is a reminder that the universe waits for no one, and that sometimes the greatest danger is not aggression from beyond, but the silence from within. And so the world continued, unaware of the moment when it could have begun a conversation with something far older, far wiser, and far more patient than itself. The signal had waited. Humanity had paused, and in the quiet, something had already been decided. The world outside continued without pause, unaware that the quiet of space had been waiting for a human voice. Inside the halls of power, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Representatives from different countries met in secure rooms, the kind of rooms insulated from the noise of ordinary life, but never from the weight of decisions. Everyone knew the signal existed. Everyone understood its importance, but no one agreed on what to do. Some spoke of caution. Military leaders warned that responding could be dangerous. "We do not know who or what is out there," they said, their voices firm, their eyes unblinking. "We cannot assume goodwill. Silence may be safer. Even a single mistake could be catastrophic." They presented charts, models, simulations of alien worlds, of civilizations far more advanced than humanity, and of the potential consequences of an unwise reply. Every example painted the same grim picture. A misstep could be the end of life as it was known. Others argued for action. Scientists, diplomats, and a few courageous advisors insisted that humanity could not afford to remain silent. "Curiosity is our strength," they said. "Exploration and understanding define us. If we wait forever, we may never know what could have been." They pressed for a message, a simple greeting, a sign that humans were aware, awake, and willing to engage. Some proposed sending mathematical sequences. Others suggested images of the Earth, symbols of life and thought. All proposals carried hope, but hope seemed fragile in the midst of fear. Religious voices added a different dimension. Some saw the signal as divine communication, a message meant to test humanity. Others warned of temptation, of forces beyond human comprehension that should not be provoked. Their words were careful, often indirect, yet they added to the growing tension. The room was crowded with opinions, all pressing against each other, all pulling in different directions. Weeks stretched into months. Meetings were held in different cities, different continents, yet no decision ever reached a conclusion. Each discussion seemed to stall, replaced by another and another. Some countries began acting independently, sending faint encoded signals into space without telling others. as if the act of sending a message could quietly satisfy both curiosity and fear. But these efforts were minor, almost invisible, and whether anyone or anything noticed was unknown. Meanwhile, scientists continued their work. Nights at the observatory became longer, filled with both awe and frustration. They watched the sky and recorded every pulse, every repetition of the signal. It was a rhythm now, a heartbeat that seemed to wait for humanity to respond, and every time it repeated, the weight of inaction pressed down more heavily on them. It was not just a signal from the stars. It was a mirror, reflecting humanity's hesitation, its caution, its fear. In quiet moments, some of the observers spoke of the future. They imagined possibilities, communication with minds far older than humans, exchange of knowledge, glimpses of technologies and ideas that could change life forever. Yet these conversations were always cut short by practical concerns. What if the signal was a trap? What if the message carried intentions that humans could not understand? And so the debate continued, circling endlessly without resolution. The world outside remained unaware. Life carried on as usual. Children went to school, families celebrated birthdays, people worried about bills, traffic, weather, and politics. News cycles cycled rapidly, focusing on crises both real and trivial, while the true marvel of the universe waited silently. To most, the signal was invisible, irrelevant. Yet for those who knew, each passing day was a quiet agony, a reminder that opportunity was slipping away. Inside the conference rooms, frustration grew. Some representatives tried to push for immediate action, only to be met with caution and refusal. Others suggested delaying any decision, claiming that more data was needed. Each delay seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a blockade that prevented action. Time, once plentiful, now felt like sand slipping too quickly through human fingers. Tension eventually reached a breaking point. Some leaders feared that if a message was sent without agreement, it could trigger panic or mistrust among other nations. Others feared that complete silence would mark humanity as timid, unworthy, or simply absent. Yet despite the pressure, nothing happened. The signal waited patiently, its pulses unbroken, its rhythm unwavering, like a clock counting down silently in the universe. The scientists watched in despair. They recorded the signal, analyzed it, tried to decode its hidden meanings, but the true message remained a mystery. Yet they sensed its intent. It was an invitation. Something was reaching out, something intelligent and patient, offering connection, and humanity's voice remained absent. The longer the silence lasted, the heavier it felt. It pressed against them, against the walls of the observatory, against the halls of power, until it became almost unbearable. Some began to act privately. A few scientists attempted to send unsanctioned signals, small and simple. They encoded mathematical sequences, patterns based on prime numbers, a universal language, hoping that someone, or something, could understand. But these efforts were limited, cautious, and tentative. Every action carried fear of discovery, fear of reprimand, fear of failure, and still the world waited, unaware of the quiet that had grown into a burden. Outside, life carried on, indifferent. People laughed, cried, worked, and slept, never knowing that the universe was patient but finite in its patience. Satellites continued to orbit, telescopes scanned distant galaxies, and humanity went about its business as if the extraordinary had never arrived. To those who watched and waited, the contrast was painful. Civilization was blind to its own opportunity, wrapped in fear, indecision, and the mundane concerns of daily life. In the observatory, long nights were filled with quiet reflection. The pulse of the signal became familiar, almost comforting, yet every beat reminded them that time was passing. They spoke in whispers, sharing thoughts about what could be gained, what could be lost, and what it meant to hesitate in the face of something greater than themselves. Each person understood the stakes, yet collective action was impossible. The signal did not demand an immediate answer, but it was waiting. And waiting, as they had come to understand, was not without consequence. Months turned into a year. The rhythm of the signal remained the same, steady and unyielding. The debate continued at the highest levels, but progress was slow, fragmented, and often contradictory. Scientists grew frustrated, diplomats grew tired, and even the most patient began to wonder if hesitation would be fatal. The sense of urgency was growing, yet it could not overcome fear, ego, and politics. Humanity's collective voice remained absent, a silence louder than any sound stretching into the void. And yet, amidst the tension, there were moments of hope. Some believed that even a small gesture might suffice, a simple acknowledgement, a sign that humanity was awake and aware. They imagined writing a message of peace, of curiosity, of unity, a greeting that could cross the vast distances of space. They pictured a world where humans and distant intelligence could communicate, exchange ideas, learn from each other. But each plan was delayed, each proposal met with caution, each attempt at action stalled by doubt. The pulse of the signal became a constant companion. It was no longer merely data on a screen. It was a reminder, a presence that weighed on the hearts and minds of those who understood. It was an echo of patience, a reflection of opportunity, a mirror of human hesitation. And as the months turned into years, that echo grew heavier. In quiet moments, the astronomers reflected on what might be waiting, on what they had failed to do. They imagined worlds far beyond Earth, civilizations capable of thinking, feeling, and waiting just as patiently as they did. They imagined that those distant minds might have been curious, welcoming, or even eager to make contact, and yet humanity had done nothing. Silence remained their answer. Outside the observatory, the world remained unaware, blissfully ignorant of the moment when the universe had reached out and humans had hesitated. Life continued, indifferent to the possibilities unfolding in the void. Children grew up without knowledge of the extraordinary events surrounding them. People lived and died oblivious to the quiet that had waited so long, and in that silence a choice was being made. A choice by humanity, even if it was made through inaction. Time marched on. The signal, steady and unwavering, remained. Those who watched it understood that waiting was not infinite. The opportunity to respond, to engage, to greet the unknown was limited. Every day of silence felt like a slow erosion of possibility. The patient intelligence on the other end of the signal was still there, still waiting, but even patience has limits. Humanity, wrapped in its fear and indecision, was slowly learning the cost of hesitation. And so the debates continued, the signals were analyzed, and humanity's collective voice remained absent. The world went on, unaware that the universe was not just observing. It was listening, waiting for a response that might never come. And in the quiet, the consequences of inaction began to loom, though no one yet understood how heavy they would be. The months of debate and hesitation had passed, but the signal remained steady and unchanging. Inside the observatories, the scientists stared at the screens with a mixture of awe and dread. It was no longer just data, they could feel its presence. Each pulse felt like a question, a heartbeat reaching out across the void, waiting for a reply that humanity had not yet given. And the silence they offered in return weighed heavily on everyone who understood. Outside the walls of science and government, life continued as usual. Streets bustled, markets thrived, and ordinary people went about their daily routines, completely unaware that the universe had quietly extended a hand. For most, the stars were distant lights, beautiful but irrelevant. For those who had been watching, every day that passed without a response felt like a missed opportunity, a slowly closing door. Inside the secure meeting rooms of global leaders, tension grew. The debate had changed from, "What should we do?" to "Why haven't we done anything yet?" Some leaders feared sending any message, worried about angering or alerting whoever was behind the signal. Others felt frustrated at the delay, arguing that time was already running out. The meetings became longer, more tense, but no resolution came. Decisions were postponed again and again, caught between fear and caution, hope and doubt. The scientists, frustrated by bureaucracy, tried to understand more about the signal on their own. They analyzed patterns, traced frequencies, and tested responses, but everything pointed to the same truth. The intelligence behind the signal was waiting. It was deliberate, patient, and curious. It was clear that this was more than a mere random transmission. Whoever or whatever was sending the signal knew humanity existed, and it wanted a response. As months turned into years, the tension inside the scientific community grew. Some observers quietly began to fear that the waiting itself might have consequences. The signal had always been patient, but patience has limits. The universe could wait longer than humans could, but that did not mean the opportunity would last forever. The unspoken dread spread quietly, and yet humanity's response remained absent. Some scientists took matters into their own hands. They prepared small private messages to send into the void. One was a simple sequence of numbers, another a pattern based on the hydrogen atom, and yet another was a carefully constructed visual symbol meant to show life on Earth. These messages were modest, humble attempts to break the silence. Each transmission was sent quietly, without fanfare, without notice, almost as if a whisper might be enough to reach across the vast emptiness of space. But nothing changed. The signal continued, waiting, unbroken, unshaken. As if measuring humanity's hesitation, the quiet became heavier, pressing down on those who watched. A constant reminder of opportunity slipping away. Some scientists felt guilt, questioning whether inaction was already too late. Others refused to believe it, holding on to the hope that a single human voice, no matter how small, could still make contact. Meanwhile, outside the observatories and government buildings, the world remained unaware. Life carried on in its usual rhythm. Children grew up, cities expanded, technology advanced. But the extraordinary moment that had arrived remained invisible to all but a few. To most people, the stars were distant, untouchable, and mysterious, but nothing more. To the few who knew, each day without response felt like a failure, a choice made by humanity itself through inaction. In the observatory, late nights became filled with quiet reflection. The pulse of the signal, steady and unchanging, was almost like a presence in the room. Some scientists spoke in whispers to one another, sharing fears, hopes, and regrets. Others sat in silence, staring at the screens, feeling the weight of waiting pressing down on them. Each pulse was a question, a heartbeat, a reminder that the universe had reached out and humanity had hesitated. The debate in the halls of power only added to the frustration. Political leaders, diplomats, and advisors continued to discuss the risks and benefits, but every meeting seemed to circle back to the same impasse. Fear of the unknown prevented action. Hope of potential contact could not overcome caution. And the signal, patient as ever, continued its quiet insistence. Some scientists began to notice subtle patterns in the signal that others had overlooked. Tiny variations, almost imperceptible, seemed to indicate that the intelligence behind the signal was aware of humanity's indecision. It was waiting, yes, but perhaps growing more aware of the silence that had been returned. The thought sent shivers down spines, not of fear alone, but of regret. Could it be that waiting too long might already have consequences that no one could yet see? Civilian curiosity began to rise in quiet corners of the world. A few amateur astronomers noticed anomalies, posting online about mysterious repeating signals. Social media filled with speculation, debates, and conspiracy theories. Most were dismissed as fantasy, hoaxes, or interference. Yet for those who had been watching for years, these small voices were a sign that the wider world might eventually pay attention. But even as curiosity grew, formal action remained absent. Humanity had yet to speak. Back in the observatories, the astronomers kept sending small personal signals. Every night they hoped for a response. Every pulse returned seemed to mock the silence. They recorded everything, cataloged every pattern, and analyzed every tiny detail. But the answers remained beyond reach. The signal continued its steady rhythm, like a heart beating in a body that was unaware it was alive. Months turned into years. A sense of urgency grew, unspoken but undeniable. The intelligence behind the signal had waited long enough to show patience, and perhaps now it was waiting for something else. A sign that humans were willing to engage, willing to step beyond hesitation. Each day without response felt heavier. Each day a reminder that time was slipping away. The scientists often walked alone in the mountains surrounding the observatories, looking up at the night sky, wondering what awaited them. Could humanity still respond? Was there still a chance to make contact? Or had the silence itself already shaped what would come next? The questions were endless, yet answers remained elusive. Even as governments debated, even as the world slept, the signal persisted. It was steady, precise, patient, and undeniably intelligent. Its pulses reached across the void, seeking a voice that humanity had not yet offered. And in that patience, there was an unspoken lesson, a reflection of humanity's own fear, its hesitation, its tendency to wait too long before acting. Some scientists began to fear that the opportunity was already slipping away. They imagined the intelligence on the other side, patient but not infinite, curious but perhaps disappointed. The thought filled them with both awe and dread. The universe had extended a hand and humanity had hesitated. What would happen if the patience finally ran out? Could it be that silence itself would be the answer? and that the universe would simply move on. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued. Children went to school, families went about their routines, cities thrived. No one noticed the extraordinary waiting, the quiet communication that hung over humanity like a shadow, and yet the scientists who watched could feel the weight. Every pulse of the signal was a reminder, every repetition a call unanswered. Humanity had delayed, debated, and hesitated, and the consequences of that quiet inaction remained unknown. Late one night, one astronomer whispered to another, "Do you think it knows we are afraid?" The other nodded, eyes fixed on the screen. "It must," they said. "It has waited for years, and we have given only silence." And in that moment they understood that the silence was no longer neutral. It had become a part of the message itself, a statement of human hesitation, a mirror of collective fear. And still the signal continued. Patient, steady, and deliberate, it waited for a response, for acknowledgement, for humanity to speak. But the world remained silent, caught in its own routine, unaware that the extraordinary had arrived and that it was still waiting. In that quiet, the tension grew. The universe had extended a hand, and humanity had yet to reach out. The months stretched into years, and the quiet became heavier, almost unbearable for those who had seen the pulse and understood its meaning. The waiting was no longer just about the signal. It was about humanity itself, its courage, its curiosity, its willingness to take a step into the unknown. And in the stillness, the question remained, could humanity find the courage to speak before it was too late? The world had moved on, or at least it thought it had. Life went on as usual. People went to work. Children laughed in playgrounds, and news cycles filled screens with politics, sports, and weather. But for those who had watched the signal from the beginning, nothing could ever be the same. Something was out there, patient and deliberate, and humanity had hesitated for too long. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable. Scientists monitoring the outer planets noticed slight anomalies in magnetic readings near Jupiter. Instruments on Mars and distant probes reported fluctuations that could not be explained by natural phenomena. These irregularities were minor at first, small enough to be dismissed by many as equipment errors. Yet those who had been tracking the signal immediately recognized a pattern. Something beyond normal physics was happening. Inside the observatories, the tension was palpable. The scientists tried to convince officials to pay attention, to take action, to prepare for the unknown. But bureaucracy moved slowly, weighed down by caution, fear, and political agendas. Reports were filed, meetings were held, and recommendations were quietly ignored or delayed. The world outside remained blissfully unaware that subtle signs of something greater were beginning to appear. The anomalies grew. Satellites recorded faint energy bursts in regions previously thought empty. Probes sent to explore distant planets transmitted strange readings that made no sense. It was as if someone or something was observing, testing, or perhaps warning. The people at the observatories debated endlessly. Some believed these were natural events, cosmic coincidences. Others were certain they were consequences of humanity's hesitation, signs that the patient observers from the signal were no longer content with waiting. Every scientist had their own fears. They imagined civilizations capable of thinking, watching, and understanding humanity far better than humans could comprehend. They imagined beings patient enough to wait for decades, yet intelligent enough to take action if silence persisted. And the thought was terrifying, not of violence, but of disappointment, of consequences, of opportunity lost forever. Despite growing evidence, the world outside remained unaware. Ordinary people continued their routines, oblivious to the quiet threats and subtle signs forming across the solar system. Governments remained distracted by internal struggles and political games. The extraordinary continued to arrive unnoticed, a shadow across humanity's daily life. The scientists, however, did not ignore it. They studied every anomaly, analyzed every odd pattern, and compiled data to prepare for the possibility of something unprecedented. Each reading, each unexpected signal, each unexplained event added to the sense of urgency. The world was standing still while subtle warnings began to appear, and every day of inaction weighed more heavily than the last. As anomalies increased, the debate within governments became tense. Military advisors pushed for preparation, scientists urged for analysis, and political leaders struggled to coordinate any meaningful response. Some countries quietly strengthened their space monitoring capabilities, while others dismissed the anomalies as minor or irrelevant. The lack of unity frustrated the scientific community. Time was running out and the signs were growing more evident. Within the observatories, late nights became endless. The signal that had waited for years continued its rhythm, steady and patient as if urging humanity to respond. And now, paired with the new anomalies, the pulse seemed almost like a warning. The intelligent presence behind the signal was no longer simply waiting. It was watching, reacting, and perhaps testing the readiness of humanity to engage. Some scientists feared it was already too late. They spoke in quiet tones, imagining the intelligence on the other end. Patient, deliberate, and now assessing not just humanity's knowledge but its hesitation, its caution, its inability to act decisively. The thought that the silence could have consequences sent shivers through the team. The universe, once patient, might now be preparing its response to humanity's prolonged quiet. The anomalies continued to grow more peculiar. Probes sent to the outer planets reported gravitational disturbances that had no visible cause. Energy readings from the asteroid belt fluctuated in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like messages humanity could not yet decode. It was as if the vast reaches of space were subtly reshaping themselves in response to human inaction. At night, some scientists would stand outside the observatories, looking at the stars and imagining what was out there. They wondered whether the intelligence behind the signal was frustrated, disappointed, or even assessing humanity with a detached curiosity. The universe had reached out, had waited patiently, and now humanity's silence was producing consequences that could no longer be ignored. Even attempts to communicate quietly, through small unsanctioned signals, failed to elicit any direct response. The pulse remained the same, steady and unbroken, and the anomalies continued to grow, forming a network of subtle warnings that only a few could understand. It was as if the universe itself was sending a message through both presence and absence. The time to act was passing, and consequences were beginning to appear. Meanwhile, everyday life on Earth remained unchanged in appearance, yet a quiet tension began to spread among those who watched. Astronomers, engineers, and technicians noticed patterns that others did not. They whispered among themselves about what it could mean, about what they might be missing, about how humanity had wasted time and hesitation. And they could not shake the growing sense that the universe was no longer simply waiting, it was responding. The sense of urgency became nearly unbearable. Scientists felt a moral responsibility to warn the world, to push for preparation. But bureaucracy and politics stifled their efforts. Meetings ended with little action, reports were shelved, and warnings were ignored. Meanwhile, subtle disturbances across the solar system became harder to deny. The intelligent observers behind the signal were no longer silent. They had begun to leave traces of their presence, patterns and anomalies that could not be mistaken for natural events. In private conversations, some scientists speculated that these disturbances were deliberate, a way to measure human awareness and response. Perhaps they were testing whether humanity had the courage, the curiosity, and the unity to respond when faced with the unknown. Or perhaps they were simply warning, letting humanity know that patience was finite and that inaction had consequences. The pulse of the signal became more than data. It became a companion, a silent reminder of opportunity lost and vigilance required. Scientists debated whether the anomalies were connected to the original signal or were independent, a new sign of intelligence taking subtle action. Either way, they understood that something extraordinary was occurring. Humanity's hesitation had consequences, and the universe was beginning to show them. Weeks turned into months, and the anomalies grew more pronounced. Energy fluctuations, gravitational distortions, and subtle patterns appeared in places previously thought empty. Satellites and probes continued to relay strange readings, forming a network of subtle, undeniable signs. And still the world outside remained largely oblivious. People went about their routines, unaware that every day of ignorance and hesitation was part of a larger story unfolding silently above them. Inside the observatories, tension became almost unbearable. The pulse of the signal continued its steady rhythm, but now, paired with the growing anomalies, it seemed like a call to action. It was as if the intelligence behind the signal had moved from curiosity to expectation. The universe had waited long enough, and subtle consequences of human hesitation were becoming apparent. Some scientists feared that the opportunity to engage had already begun to slip away. Others clung to hope, believing that a single human voice could still reach across the void. But the sense of urgency was undeniable. Every new anomaly, every unexplained reading, every subtle disturbance in the solar system was a reminder that humanity had delayed, and that delay carried consequences that could not yet be fully understood. As nights grew long and the rhythm of the signal continued, the scientists came to a quiet understanding. Humanity's hesitation had shifted the balance. The universe had extended a hand, waited patiently, and now was beginning to respond, not with violence but with presence, with subtle signs, with undeniable proof that waiting too long carries a cost. The anomalies were warnings, the pulse a mirror, and the silence humanity had returned was shaping the events that were to come. Even as the world outside remained unaware, a small group of observers knew that the extraordinary had already begun. The universe had reached out. Humanity had hesitated, and now the consequences were forming in ways that were quiet, subtle, but unavoidable. The patient signal had become a reflection of human hesitation, and the anomalies across the solar system were evidence that the universe would not wait forever. And so, late at night, the scientists continued to watch. They documented every anomaly, analyzed every fluctuation, and debated every possible meaning. Each day brought new signs that the patient intelligence had begun to act, subtly, deliberately, and with intention. The quiet was no longer neutral. It was part of a story that humanity had begun to write, and the consequences of hesitation were becoming impossible to ignore. The universe had waited. Humanity had hesitated, and now the SIG. The anomalies that had begun subtly were no longer subtle. Satellites flickered unexpectedly. Probes that had traveled for years began sending distorted readings. The instruments, once trusted and reliable, now seemed to hint at something beyond human comprehension. The pulse of the original signal still came, steady and rhythmic but now paired with the strange, growing disturbances across the solar system. It became impossible to ignore. Inside the observatories, scientists worked frantically. Long nights stretched into early mornings, and discussions that had once been theoretical now carried a sharp urgency. The evidence was undeniable. Something or someone was approaching. They debated the implications, but no debate could prepare them for the reality that was about to arrive. Across the world, governments remained divided. Some were aware of the growing anomalies, but action was slow and fragmented. Political agendas and bureaucracy slowed every attempt at coordination. Military forces prepared quietly, observing, scanning, and analyzing, but most of the world remained unaware of the danger or the opportunity that was heading toward them. Then, the first unmistakable signs appeared. Telescopes detected massive objects moving through the outer rim of the solar system. At first, some dismissed the readings as errors or miscalculations, but soon multiple observatories confirmed the same results. The objects were enormous, larger than anything humans had built in space, and they moved with deliberate coordination. It was clear these were not natural objects, asteroids or comets, but something intelligent, something purposeful. Panic began to ripple quietly through the scientific community. The anomalies were no longer distant mysteries. They were approaching. Satellites detected faint energy pulses, shapes in the void, and strange gravitational fluctuations that could not be explained by normal physics. The patient intelligence that had sent the signal so long ago was now showing itself, and humanity had no choice but to face it. In the observatories, the atmosphere was tense. Scientists ran calculations over and over, trying to understand the speed and trajectory of the approaching objects. The results were unsettling. The objects would reach the inner solar system within months. The universe that had waited patiently for a human response was now making its presence undeniable, leaving humanity with only one choice: to watch and hope, or to try to respond before it was too late. The pulse of the original signal continued, almost taunting in its rhythm. It was as if the intelligence behind it had been waiting all this time, testing humanity's hesitation, measuring its patience, and now the waiting was over. The message had been delivered, the silence had been answered with consequences, and the universe had moved forward while humanity had remained still. Some scientists proposed sending a message again, hoping to communicate before the objects entered the inner solar system. Others argued that it might be too late, that any attempt to respond now could be misunderstood or ignored. Fear and hope battled in every mind. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were real, immediate, and unavoidable. Civilian life began to feel subtle changes. People noticed that satellites flickered, GPS devices failed sporadically, and some communication systems were temporarily interrupted. News reports described unusual auroras near the poles, strange magnetic readings, and unexplained energy spikes. Most dismissed these as natural phenomena or technical malfunctions. But the scientists watching knew the truth. Something extraordinary was arriving. As the massive objects drew closer, governments began issuing quiet statements, urging calm while preparing for the unknown. Military forces were put on alert. Spacecraft were launched to gather data, and emergency protocols were drafted. The world was waking up slowly, but the moment of realization came too late for the earlier hesitation to be erased. Humanity had been warned, and now the waiting had ended. Observers at the observatories could not tear their eyes from the screens. The pulse of the signal, once a silent question, now felt like an invitation or perhaps a judgment. The approaching objects were precise, deliberate, and undeniable. They moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, coordination, and intent. Humanity had been patient, cautious, and slow to respond, and the universe had waited, measured, and now acted. Communication attempts were made again, small messages sent to the approaching objects. Simple sequences, greetings, images of Earth, all meant to show awareness and willingness to engage. But responses were not immediate. The pulse of the signal continued, steady and unchanged while the objects drew closer. For the first time, humanity felt the weight of missed opportunity. The patient intelligence had waited, and now its presence was undeniable. Across the world, people began to notice the changes. Telescopes captured images of enormous shapes at the edge of the solar system, moving with precision and coordination. Scientific data showed energy fluctuations and gravitational anomalies that defied current understanding. Even for those who had not been watching the signal, the signs were clear. Something extraordinary had arrived. Inside the observatories, a quiet fear settled over the scientists. They had watched, measured, and waited, but the decisions that could have been made earlier were delayed, and now the arrival of the objects left little room for preparation. Humanity had hesitated for years, and the universe had finally moved. The objects entered the solar system with purpose. Their paths were calculated, deliberate, and precise. Observers could see the energy pulses surrounding them, the distortions in space that indicated intelligence far beyond human understanding. It was not an invasion, not yet, but it was an undeniable presence that humans could not ignore. For the first time, the world began to realize the consequences of its earlier silence. The patient signal had been a call, an invitation, a test. Humanity had delayed, debated, and hesitated, and now the universe had arrived to observe, assess, and perhaps act. The quiet that had been maintained for so long had been interpreted, measured, and now carried weight. Scientists and military observers worked together frantically to understand the objects, to predict their paths, and to prepare for any outcome. Every calculation was checked and double-checked. Every reading was analyzed with urgency. The pulse of the original signal continued, steady and rhythmic, as if marking the moment humanity had delayed too long. As the objects approached the inner solar system, their purpose became clearer. They moved with deliberate patterns, avoiding collisions with planets and satellites, yet positioning themselves in ways that suggested observation. It was as if the intelligence behind the original signal was examining humanity itself, watching how it reacted, how quickly it could respond, and whether it could rise to the challenge of engagement. In the observatories, scientists debated how to interpret the arrival. Were the objects hostile, neutral, or simply curious? Were they assessing humanity's intelligence, testing its courage, or merely observing? No one could answer with certainty, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on every mind. The universe had arrived, and humanity had no choice but to respond, even if the response was only observation. The first reports of unusual phenomena on Earth began to reach the public. Northern and southern lights appeared at unexpected locations, magnetic fields fluctuated, and satellites experienced temporary blackouts. People were frightened, confused, and curious. Governments urged calm, but the reality was undeniable. Humanity was no longer alone in its solar system. Something extraordinary had arrived, and it was watching. The pulse of the original signal continued, almost like a heartbeat marking the arrival of the objects. For those who had been watching all along, the moment was bittersweet. Humanity had hesitated for years, and now the presence of intelligence in the solar system was undeniable. The universe had extended its hand, waited patiently, and finally arrived. Humanity had not answered in time, and the consequences were unfolding before their eyes. Every new observation, every new anomaly, and every pulse of energy became a reminder of the earlier hesitation. The patient intelligence that had sent the signal was no longer distant. It was here, deliberate, precise, and undeniable. Humanity could no longer ignore it. The quiet that had been maintained for so long had been replaced by presence, and the arrival of the objects marked the turning point. As nights passed, scientists continued to monitor the approaching objects. Each reading, each image, each energy spike was analyzed with intensity. The world had waited for years without responding to the signal, and now the objects themselves had arrived. The pulse of the original message continued, steady, unyielding, a reminder of opportunity lost and consequences unfolding. The objects moved with intent, deliberate and precise, yet they caused no immediate harm. Their presence was not violent, but it carried undeniable authority. It was as if the universe was saying that the time for patience was over, and that humanity would now have to face the reality of its hesitation. Every measurement, every anomaly, every pulse was a lesson in the cost of waiting. Scientists watched the skies and felt a mixture of awe, fear, and regret. Humanity had hesitated, debated, and waited too long. The universe had reached out, and now its presence was undeniable. The objects, deliberate and precise, marked a turning point in human history. The quiet was over. The waiting had ended, and the consequences of hesitation had arrived. The arrival of the objects changed everything. The world could no longer pretend that the universe was distant or indifferent. Satellites flickered, energy fields shimmered unpredictably, and the pulse of the original signal continued, steady and deliberate, almost as if it were marking the moment humanity had waited too long. Scientists, military personnel, and leaders alike realized that humanity had entered a new reality, one that demanded attention, courage, and understanding. In observatories around the globe, scientists worked tirelessly. They charted the paths of the enormous objects, studied the energy fluctuations, and attempted to communicate once more. Every message sent was cautious and deliberate, encoded in mathematics, images, and sequences designed to be universally understandable. Yet each pulse from the object seemed to respond in its own way, not with words, not with aggression, but with movement, energy patterns, and subtle changes that hinted at understanding. For the first time, humanity felt a presence that was not just intelligence, but intelligence far older, far more patient, and far beyond human comprehension. The initial hesitation now felt like a lifetime ago, a period of ignorance that could not be reversed. The universe had waited, and now it had shown itself. The consequences of the long silence were not catastrophic in violence, but in clarity, the realization that humans had been observed, measured, and judged in their hesitation. Governments scrambled to coordinate. Military forces, space agencies, and scientific institutions worked together, breaking through the bureaucratic walls that had delayed action for so long. Spacecraft were repositioned to gather more data. Telescopes scanned the skies for additional signs. Satellites were recalibrated to monitor energy fluctuations. Humanity moved as one, even if belatedly for the first time in this encounter. Public awareness grew as well. People across the world saw unusual auroras, strange patterns in the night sky, and disturbances in communication networks. Panic was minimal because the arrival was not violent but awe-inspiring. Humanity collectively realized it was part of a larger universe in ways it had only imagined. The presence of the objects made it impossible to ignore the intelligence that had reached out years earlier. The silent signal that had been patiently waiting had finally made itself undeniable. Within the observatories, scientists began to decode patterns in the energy pulses. Subtle rhythms suggested a language of mathematics and logic. The pulse seemed to recognize attempts at communication, acknowledging human efforts while continuing its steady beat. For the first time, it became clear that the intelligence was observing not only humanity as a species, but individual efforts to respond. Patience, curiosity, and initiative were being measured in a way humans could understand. Humanity began to respond more boldly. Messages were sent in increasingly complex forms, using mathematics, visual symbols, and sequences representing life on Earth. Scientists coordinated globally, sharing data and observations. Each small breakthrough was celebrated, even as the objects continued their presence with quiet authority. There was no hostility, no aggression, only observation and engagement. The universe was finally listening to humanity, and humanity belatedly was learning how to respond. At night, the skies were filled with wonder. People gathered in small groups on rooftops or in parks looking up at the stars. Astronomers explained what had been seen, media outlets shared verified data, and schools incorporated real-time observations into lessons. Humanity, which had been blind to the extraordinary, now experienced a shared moment of realization and awe. The patient signal and the approaching objects had changed not just science but culture, perspective, and understanding. For scientists, the greatest lesson was clarity. Humanity's earlier hesitation had delayed connection, had left years of silence where curiosity should have spoken. But now there was no choice but to act, to learn, and to engage. Every day brought new observations, and with them, new opportunities to understand the intelligence that had reached across the cosmos. The world moved cautiously but decisively, aware that the universe had always waited, and now it was no longer waiting silently. Diplomats and leaders worked to unify communication. Messages were crafted with care, combining mathematics, universal physical constants, and representations of life on Earth. Each transmission carried humility, respect, and a willingness to engage. Humanity had learned the cost of hesitation, and its voice now sought not dominance but understanding. The patient intelligence and steady in its rhythm responded subtly to each effort, signaling recognition and perhaps acknowledgement of humanity's belated engagement. The energy anomalies and gravitational disturbances began to form patterns. Scientists interpreted these as signs of intelligence actively shaping the environment to communicate, test, or observe. It was a gentle lesson. Presence itself can be a form of dialogue. Humanity had learned to watch, to measure, and finally to respond. The quiet that had once been a weight was now a channel for learning, understanding, and engagement. In private moments, scientists reflected on the earlier years of hesitation. They remembered the debates, the endless meetings, the fear of unknown consequences. They realized that silence had been both a shield and a barrier. The patient signal had waited, and the approaching objects had arrived not with aggression, but with an unmistakable presence that forced humanity to confront its own limitations, fears, and delays. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and responsibility. People around the world shared a collective awe. Images of the night sky, videos of auroras, and reports of satellite disturbances spread rapidly. Humanity had entered a new chapter, one in which its place in the universe was no longer theoretical, but undeniably real. The pulse of the original signal, still steady, served as a reminder that patience and waiting could lead to understanding, but only if humans took the courage to engage. As communication attempts became more sophisticated, small patterns of recognition emerged. Scientists began to understand that the intelligence behind the objects in the signal was teaching, responding, and perhaps testing. It was not hostile but deliberate. Humanity had been observed for years, its hesitation noted, and its eventual engagement now welcomed in a subtle, deliberate way. The quiet had ended and the dialogue had begun. The consequences of the earlier silence were not catastrophic, but they were instructive. Humanity had learned that patience has limits, that hesitation carries weight, and that opportunities lost may take years to recover. The pulse of the signal, now paired with the deliberate presence of the objects, became a teacher. Humanity listened, observed, and learned as the universe had always intended. In cities, schools, and homes, people shared the experience of being observed, of participating in the first true engagement with intelligence beyond Earth. It became a shared moment of reflection. Humans had hesitated, but they had learned. Curiosity, courage, and collaboration had finally responded to a patient call from the universe. The lessons of the past years shaped not only science but culture, perspective, and collective awareness. The objects continued their presence, moving deliberately but peacefully. Energy fluctuations, gravitational anomalies, and subtle pulses continued, but each now felt like a conversation, a recognition, or an acknowledgement. Humanity had learned to respond, to measure, and to understand. The universe, patient and intelligent, had not punished hesitation. It had taught, waited, and now welcomed engagement. Late at night, scientists stood together looking at screens and skies, reflecting on the journey. The first years of waiting, the endless debates, the cautious silence, all had been part of the story. Humanity had hesitated, and in that hesitation had learned patience, responsibility, and humility. The objects and the pulse of the original signal were reminders that engagement requires courage, timing, and understanding. The pulse continued, steady as ever, a heartbeat across the cosmos. The objects moved with intent but without aggression, marking a presence that demanded observation and response. Humanity had finally learned the value of speaking, of reaching out, and of acknowledging intelligence beyond itself. The patient silence of the universe had transformed into a dialogue, subtle but profound. For the first time, humanity felt a connection, not through conflict or fear, but through presence, observation, and acknowledgement. The signal, the objects, and the anomalies were teachers, guides, and mirrors. Humanity had hesitated, but it had finally begun to respond. The quiet was over, and the patient universe had welcomed the delayed engagement. Even as life on Earth returned to routines, nothing would ever be the same. Humanity had looked up, hesitated, and finally found its voice. The universe had waited patiently, and now through presence, observation, and dialogue, humanity had begun to learn its place in the cosmos. In observatories, schools, and homes, people looked to the skies with new understanding. The pulse of the signal continued as a heartbeat across space, reminding humans that patience is a gift, hesitation has consequences, and courage to engage can lead to connection. Humanity had been tested, it had hesitated, and it had finally begun to respond. The patient intelligence had arrived. Humanity had learned. The silence of the past was now a lesson in humility, awareness, and curiosity. The universe had waited, and now humanity could finally speak.